A climate change fund trust would be established here soon, and government will be embarking on an awareness campaign to sensitize residents about the socio-economic impact of climate change on the territory. The Virgin Islands would need approximately $50 million annually to adequately address the impact of climate change. Noting that climate change poses a great threat to the BVI's development, Minister for Natural Resources and Labor Dr. Kedrick Pickering says donor countries to the Climate Change Fund have offered $4.3 billion to help small island development states fund mitigation efforts.
One of the really big issues facing especially smaller countries is how to access the funds. You've got to have a mechanism in place to be able to access the money. So the money is available, but nobody's going to write a check and say, take it, run, go, and go to have a party. That's what the Climate Change Trust Fund is, a mechanism by which we will then be able to access that funding. And alongside accessing the funding will be the ability for us to work diligently to implement the factors involved in the climate change policy, one of which, of course, has to do with the whole question of renewable energy and the conversion factors therein.
Environmental lawyer out of Canada, George DeBert Romilly, works with Deputy Director and Science Advisor at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, Dr. Ulrich Trotz, as consultants to the government of the Virgin Islands to implement the climate change adaptation policy. DeBert Romilly says the BVI has taken the lead in this effort throughout the Caribbean.
And that's where the climate change adaptation policy is really focused, to try and identify what your priorities are, what your needs, and more importantly, how you as a country can go forward to address these risks. Attendant upon that is obviously the fact there needs to be some new financing for this. There's new measures need to be put in place, new activities need to be funded, and clearly this is outside the capacity of many governments around the world, let alone small territories such as the British Virgin Islands. This recognition has been reflected more recently in the discussions at the international negotiations level. Under the Climate Change Convention, there's recognition that because we are not able to reduce the greenhouse gases to the levels that are required to prevent severe impacts to vulnerable countries, that there is a need for the industrialized nations who are causing this pollution to make available financing so that vulnerable countries such as the British Virgin Islands can have access to financing needed to put in place these measures to address the risks. And this is very much where we are supporting the process, and we're very pleased that the British Virgin Islands is certainly taking the lead in this regard in this region, in not only having a policy approved by Cabinet, but more importantly, putting in place the financial mechanisms, the Climate Change Trust Fund, to implement and finance those urgent priority measures.
A vulnerability impact assessment conducted in the BVI is now used as a model to guide similar work in other Caribbean countries. Dr. Ulrich Trotz says the effects of climate change are already affecting the region. He says coral bleaching is on the rise, and there is a migration of several species of fish from warmer to colder oceans.
What we are seeing in the Caribbean is that with the rise in global temperatures, we're getting a rise in sea level temperatures, which translates into bleaching of our coral reefs. Now, this will have serious consequences for the Caribbean, not only from the tourism point of view, that we're losing a natural attraction, but the reefs happen to be a habitat for fisheries. And in the region, again, the highest intake or protein intake comes from the marine environment. If we lose our fish stocks, that will have some negative influence on our food security and the nutritional integrity of our people. Not only that, more frightening are some results that are coming out globally to show fish stocks migrating from warmer seas to cooler seas. So like our people in the Caribbean, our fish are migrating northwards. And this is another serious issue that we have to face. So as far as you're concerned here, like the rest of the region, Your food security is at risk. Water resources are at risk. There are impacts on health. There is now, some linkages between changing weather patterns and increased incidence of dengue. The tourism sector particularly is very vulnerable. A lot of their stock is along the coast there in vulnerable areas. So this is why we say it's no longer a simple environmental problem, but a serious developmental challenge where, as a result of these events, funds that are earmarked for development have to be diverted to dealing with some of the destruction that we are seeing as a result of living in a Caribbean where the climate is changing.
The UK's Department for International Development provided up to £4.9 million to the Regional Climate Change Centre to assist vulnerable countries and overseas territories to withstand the impacts of climate change and variability.